Hello, Philosophy of Alcohol folks. Happy Tuesday. I hope that this finds you well. I hope that you are feeling safe and you are healthy and happy and you're excited to kind of keep diving into the philosophy of alcohol. So last week we kind of set a little bit of our foundation, our groundwork on topics as they relate to terminology used in philosophy and various branches of philosophy, with metaphysics, epistemology, axiology, and logic, right? And kind of like unpacking how those various topics, those various branches of philosophy might very well play a role in kind of our course moving forward, okay? So if you didn't watch those videos, I definitely recommend going back and again to kind of have a solid foundation of what metaphysics studies, what epistemology studies, what logic studies, and what axiology studies, for the fact that all of that will be important for the purposes of our course going forward. So today I want to kind of spend a couple of videos unpacking terms that relate to alcohol, okay? And not just like terms as it relates to, like, oh, I got hammered last night, but rather I want to focus on like particular types of alcohols, right? So when I say wine, we kind of know what we're talking about. Or when I say a distillate, what are we talking about, okay? So the first video, this one in particular, will be a little bit technical as it relates to definitions, but then I think the other video or the other two videos will be a little bit more open-ended, okay? And so the first kind of way to start class, and this would be the way that I would start, this is the way that I'm starting class today, is asking like, well, in the same way that we think about philosophy, like what is philosophy? Well, I think it's important to ask like, well, what is alcohol, right? Like what is alcohol? Like, yes, it's a chemical composition. Yes, it's a breakdown of compounds, etc. But like, what else might it be? And how else might we think of like what alcohol is, okay? And does it matter how we distinguish between various styles and various types of alcohol, okay? So the various definition of alcohol here is a colorless, volatile, flammable liquid, which is produced by the natural fermentation of sugars and is an intoxicating constituent of wine, beer, spirits, and other drinks, and is also used as an industrial solvent and as fuel. Okay? Like that's the dictionary definition of alcohol. A colorless, volatile, flammable liquid, which is produced by natural fermentation of sugars, and is intoxicating and is the intoxicating constituent of wine, beer, spirits, and other drinks. It is also used as an industrial solvent and as fuel, right? So like when we think about alcohol kind of in that context, it's kind of like interesting to think about it in the way of saying, when I have a beer, it's like, oh, I'm drinking industrial solvent. Like that's not necessarily the case, but it is, wrapped up kind of in that definition. So we have this kind of like baseline definition here, right? We have this, overarching, encompassing definition that is a colorless, volatile, flammable liquid which is produced by the natural fermentation of sugars and in the intoxicating constituent of wine, beer, and other drinks, and is also used as an industrial solvent and as fuel, right? And you sometimes hear like really high proof, like drinking alcohol being able to like light on fire, right? And that means that it's got a really high percentage of alcohol, right? And you hear like old tall tales of like moonshine being so high proof that, and you hear this phrase as well, like it burns your inside sometimes. Like if you take a shot of whiskey or if you even a shot of tequila, like you feel this like burning sensation. Well, maybe we feel this burning sensation for the fact that, again, the chemical components of alcohol are such that they are used sometimes as like an industrial solvent or even as fuel, right? And then we tease that out a little bit further and we say, all right, well, this idea of like alcohol being fuel, right? We know that it can be used as like a chemical fuel, but what about like a fuel for, again, social lubrication, a fuel for engagement with self and engagement with others as it relates to like what alcohol is or could be, okay? And then there are various kind of like styles and types of alcohol here, okay? The first one that I want to bring our attention to is beer, which is an alcoholic drink made from yeast fermented malt flavored with hops. Okay, so again, dictionary definition of like what beer is: alcoholic drink made with yeast fermented malt flavored with hops. So again, this very like kind of baseline definition of what beer is, right? And then you kind of build up. So in order to have like those really like complex, like maybe you've seen, often you find this with dark beers, but like a caramel oak barrel aged molasses infused chocolate stout. Okay, so it's got like lots of components here. Well, again, the baseline for that chocolate stout to be even made is that it is at the heart of it, right? A flavored drink made with yeast, fermented malt, flavored with hops, and then you kind of build outwardly to that. Okay? So again, beer, yeast, malt, hops. Wine, an alcoholic drink made from fermented grape juice. Okay, fermented grape. And in particular, wine is fermented with Vinus vinifera, which is the genetic name of the wine stock, the wine root rather. For instance, like you can't really make wine as we know it with Concord grapes. Like that's a different vinifera. That's a different wine. That's a different grape genus, species. I think I'm not using that term correctly, but nevertheless. So again, wine being made from fermented grape, especially Vinus vinifera. And again, typically you see white grapes, so Chardonnay, Albarino, Pinot Grigio. And you'll see red grapes, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Petit Verdot, Cab Franc. I mean, the list could go on and on as you distinguish between white grapes and red grapes. And then rosé is actually, it's not an actual grape, but it's a style of winemaking. Okay? Similarly to sparkling wine. Okay? That sparkling wine is a style of winemaking. Okay? So it's not that grapes are de facto naturally sparkling. They have to be made a particular way. Okay? And then we kind of move our focus to spirits. And in particular in this discussion, I want us to focus on and like an easy way of like categorizing spirits is kind of thinking like terms of like dark spirits and clear spirits. And again, you've maybe been familiar with this if you do consume alcohol, but if you don't, that is all right. But yeah, clear spirits or dark spirits. And kind of the clear spirits, kind of the easy three spirits to kind of like remember as they relate to like the clear spirits for our purposes: vodka, gin, and tequila. Okay, those are clear spirits. Vodka is an alcohol spirit from Russian origin. Poland would probably dispute this. Made by distilling rye, wheat, potatoes. Okay, so you can find that there is potato vodka, there's wheat vodka. You can find that again, vodka can be distilled from a lot of different entities. Okay? So an alcoholic spirit of Russian, I'm going to parentheses, or Polish descent. Again, why a lively debate that I'm sure causes many fights between Russia and Poland. Distillation of rye, wheat, or potatoes. Okay. Gin is a clear alcoholic spirit distilled from grain or malt and flavored with juniper berries. So if you're not too familiar with gin, and if you go out and try some gin, there's always kind of like an herbaceousness. There's a little bit of like an herbal feel to gin. Well, that's the flavoring of the juniper berry. Okay, juniper actually grows out here in the West, and so I know that I've been on hikes before. I've been out camping, and I like get a smell, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that smells like gin, and it's because there's a juniper bush nearby, or we just walked by one or something like that. And then tequila is a Mexican alcoholic spirit made from the agave plant. So again, and you might see, I said that those three, tequila, gin, vodka, are clear spirits. Some tequila does get aged, and so it will, and it's usually aged in barrel, and so when it's aged in barrel, it will kind of take on a brown hue or brown color, brown hue. But typically, those are three kind of clear spirits. There's other clear spirits out there, but for our purposes, those three kind of work the best for just terminology's sake. So again, vodka coming from potatoes and wheat, rye, and then gin coming from distilled grain or malt flavored with juniper, and then tequila, which is distilled from the agave plant. Okay? And then rum actually presents us with kind of an interesting area of some rums are clear, some rums are dark. Okay? So that's why I'm not saying that rum is a clear spirit or a dark spirit. There are some rums that are clear, some rums that are dark. And rum is an alcoholic spirit distilled from sugarcane residues or often made with molasses. So with rum, you'll find sometimes like a sweeter profile, kind of like a clove spice profile. And when I say profile, I mean taste. Okay? And typically coming from sugarcane. So you'll see a lot of rum coming from the Caribbean or kind of that region for the fact that sugarcane grows really well in that kind of climate. So you'll see a lot of, again, Dominican Republic rum. I think that's where Bacardi is. You'll find other Jamaican rum, etc. And then I want to turn just our focus to some brown spirits. So we've got clear spirits and we've got dark spirits. And typically these dark spirits, which again, you'll find that there is some rum that is dark rum. And sometimes those dark rums are more so made with molasses. So that's what gives it kind of that dark, sometimes caramely almost color. Some dark spirits to be on the lookout for is whiskey, which is a distilled spirit from malted grain, especially barley or rye. And with whiskey, we might be familiar with Irish whiskey, Canadian whiskey, or Japanese whiskey. And all three of those differing kinds of whiskeys have different styles, right? So they're either made in a different kind of way, but using the same base parts. Where distilled spirit from malted grain, especially barley or rye, and then usually aged in some capacity in oak barrels, which gives that whiskey, the again brown color that we're used to. Bourbon is unique on its own. Bourbon is a kind of whiskey. It's kind of American whiskey in particular, distilled from corn and rye, but it must be 51% corn. And we find typically that a lot of bourbons will come from Kentucky. And we'll actually watch a documentary here in early March called Neat. And I think that you'll find that it's pretty enjoyable. So, which specifically talks about some of the interesting designations of bourbon and some of the history of bourbon. So we'll dive kind of more deeply into that in a couple of months. And again, bourbon is a kind of whiskey. So we have whiskey, and then we have Irish whiskey, Canadian whiskey, Japanese whiskey. We have American whiskey, so you think of like Jack Daniels. Because Jack Daniels is an American whiskey, but it's not a bourbon. So there is still like distinction there. And then when you think of like something like Fireball, when you think of something like Fireball, that would be like an American whiskey, but with cinnamon additives, cinnamon flavor. Okay? All right. And then we have Scotch whiskey. So again, another kind of whiskey. And sometimes with Scotch whiskey, you'll hear this word, is it peated or not? Which is a style, again, of the way that the whiskey is made. And peated gives it this kind of like smokiness to it, which some people really like, some people really don't like. But it's another, again, kind of whiskey specifically made in Scotland. Scotch, Scotland, Irish whiskey made in Ireland, Japanese whiskey made in Japan, American whiskey made in America, bourbon made a particular kind of way in America, Canadian whiskey, you think of Pendleton, made in Canada, right? And then lastly, brandy is a strong alcoholic spirit distilled from wine or fermented fruit juice. So this is a good example. There's a spirit out of Chile and Peru called pisco. And pisco is made from grapes, the same like Vinus vinifera as wine, but it's made in such a way that it's kind of made into a brandy and distilled, and so it has a unique kind of space on its own, right? You'll also find, like with brandy, you'll find like apple brandy, you'll find like pear brandy. Again, this style of alcohol that uses fruit or fruit juice to kind of infuse in it as it relates to a style of alcohol. And then like, yeah, you'll hear the term like brandy wine or something like that. And usually that's just to denote kind of a style that's like a hybrid of brandy and wine, like dandelion brandy wine or something like that. Yeah. All right, this video went much longer than I expected, but we will pick up with the next one, kind of breaking down, I think, more philosophically interesting aspects of some definitions and categories as it relates to alcohol. So this video being primarily important just to, again, get our vocabulary familiar with various styles of, types of alcohol, types of alcohol. So next video in just a moment.